Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the next round of U54 seminars. Today we're going to be exploring qualitative research, more specifically looking at the decision between remote and in-person data collection methods. My name is Anna Revette. I'm a qualitative research scientist at the Survey and Data Management Corps at Dana-Farber. And so especially kind of thinking about this within the shifting research landscape where a lot of us have now been limited around our in-person capacities with the COVID-19 outbreak and social distancing. So while this presentation was actually developed before the COVID outbreak, you'll find that, it'll perhaps provide some guidance around some questions to ask, because making the best decision about either delaying or perhaps changing your data collection methods, a lot of different aspects come into play, a lot of different factors. It's not a simple switch, and going kind of virtual isn't the right switch for all projects. So today I'm going to walk through some of the reasons, considerations. I'm not going to focus specifically or entirely on the COVID interruptions, but kind of about research in general outside of the crisis. But some of the considerations will be applicable to what we're seeing now with the limited in-person capacity. So hopefully this will be helpful for considering research considerations both during and hopefully after the COVID limitations on in-person research are explored. So just an outline of today. I'm going to walk through specifically looking at interviews, looking at phone versus in-person, as well as focus groups, online video versus in-person. This isn't necessarily a fully comprehensive, not based on a full systematic review of all of the research out there, but hopefully we'll kind of approach and address some of the more frequent issues and considerations that people come across. And so this is based on, a lot of the different projects I've been working on, as well as literature reviews, grants, and some of the practical experience that we have in the Survey and Data Management Corps conducting in-person and remote data collection on a variety of different projects. For the purposes of this discussion, as I said, I'm going to focus on telephone and in-person interviews and then in-person synchronous online groups. There are other options out there, but just to kind of hone in and focus and make this manageable for a one-time seminar. My contact information is available on the website, so please feel free to reach out if there's more specific circumstances that haven't been covered today, but you think would be helpful to address maybe some of the unique considerations for your own personal research. So any given approach is not necessarily inherently better than another. There's pros and cons to consider with each idea, and kind of developing your methodological approach has to really best align with a variety of different aspects. So does the approach align with your research questions and your aims? Thinking kind of scientifically about the use of different data collection methods, especially kind of determining whether or not focus groups or interviews are appropriate. It's a little bit beyond the scope of what I'll cover today, but I'll address a little bit more of that towards the end of the discussion. You're going to want to make sure that you focus in on what's best for your specific study, your research questions, your aims, and you really want to kind of best align your data collection method with, your specific research project, kind of weighing the pros and the cons. A lot of this is a judgment call based on where your priorities are, what's going to maximize your enrollment and participation, what's going to minimize participant risk and burden, but also kind of what fits with your aims overall. You're also going to want to think about participant burden, not only in kind of the physical logistical sense in terms of how you're getting them to the location they need to be, but also the emotional burden that comes along with that. So some studies might involve vulnerable populations or minority populations, and thinking about kind of the emotional and psychological burden that the topic at hand might be of concern for your study. You're also going to want to think about, as I mentioned before, interviews versus focus groups, but really thinking about the guide. And I'm a big proponent of spending a lot of time with the development from your team and an iterative kind of approach to spending a lot of time developing that guide, whether it be for interviews or focus group moderator guides, making sure that you have made kind of a comprehensive and thoughtful guide that really approaches your research questions and aims in a thoughtful way, utilizing appropriate language for your population, but also really thinking about the questions that you're asking and how each one of those questions aligns with your broader research aim. So being able to really be thoughtful and spending some time on your research guide is, I encourage that and recommend that for whatever study, regardless of the topic at hand. You also have to kind of think about this in terms of the practical limitations or practical realities of your research study. Thinking about how much time and money you have, especially if this is grant funding that's moving this project forward. Who's on your research team? What kind of experience do they have? What kind of training do they have? An untrained or unexperienced interviewer or focus group moderator can really have an impact on the depth and quality of your data. So really thinking about kind of these as kind of backdrop to the discussion that we're going to have today about trying to decide whether you're going in person or virtual or in person versus telephonic. Really just thinking about these questions that are applicable regardless of the data collection method, thinking really thoroughly about the most appropriate approach, developing a thoughtful guide, and thinking about the resources you have, both in terms of team members, but also finances and time resources as well. So I'm going to start first looking at telephone and versus in-person interviews. So I'm basing this assessment on the understanding and the assumption that you have an experienced, qualified interviewer, you have a thoughtfully designed guide, good research questions. And so what I'm going to do is walk through a couple of these considerations and then hopefully provide some kind of tangible examples of research decisions that we have had to make at the Survey and Data Management Corps when it comes to some of these different topics. So as I walk through, I'm going to have either a check mark or a question mark next to each one of these considerations for in-person versus telephone. And so these are going to be generalities, and each study, of course, will have to make its own judgment calls. And these are by no means absolute statements on the data collection method approach. Think of it more as kind of a guide to considerations. It's by no means prescriptive. And it's going to be, when it comes to your actual research, a kind of a cost-benefit analysis for each step along the way. You're going to have to think about where are your priorities, which issues are important to your study, the topic at hand, the participants. And so also the way that I've written this table out, you're going to see that I treat some of these considerations as kind of discrete categories, but a lot of them kind of weave and blend together or reinforce each other. So I'll explore that a little bit more as I walk through here. So the check marks that are going to pop up on the screen will indicate the preferred method, and the question marks that will pop up will indicate some doubts or possible barriers to the successful completion of the consideration at hand. By no means absolute, but perhaps introducing some more difficulties or problematic aspects. So starting with depth and quality of data. You'll see that both of these have check marks. Both telephone interviews and in-person interviews are valid methods for gathering research data. The validity of in-person interviews versus the telephone interview, really they've both been found to be equally effective. You'll find some studies that might suggest that telephone interviews tend to be shorter with less depth. However, there's also studies that point to the fact that around certain topics or with certain populations, that the telephone interview might actually provide some anonymity and comfort, and therefore allowing the more in-depth exploration of topics that might be more difficult to explore in person. So, you'll read kind of studies that point to both sides, but overall, I think if it's a well-designed study with an experienced interviewer and a well-developed guide, both of these can be valid, effective ways to collect data. For the control over the environment, um, when you think about, for example, what environment these discussions or interviews are happening, where this conversation is happening. You know, social interaction is impacted by the context. It's impacted by the environment. We won't be able to escape that, whether we're in person or telephone. And so, for example, if you're bringing participants into a conference room, for example, we did this for one of our studies that was looking at social media and tobacco use and norm conflict. We had near complete control of the environment. And so there are certain ways that, you know, we were able to control everything from the light to distractions to the temperature of the room. And so in some ways, in person would perhaps, in certain circumstances, provide you a certain amount of control. However, when it comes to studies that look more at patient in-person interviews that oftentimes happen in our clinic or in our infusion units, you will see multiple interruptions. There's clinical interruptions from nurses and doctors and visits. And so you also have to navigate the presence of other family or friends, changes of plans when appointments go early or late. And so, you know, and that's a circumstance where you have limited in-person control. With telephone interviews, you can always suggest that people find a quiet place where they feel comfortable and they are free from distractions, but you are really limited in your ability to enforce that suggestion. You can't prevent someone from driving down the road or going to the grocery store, having interruptions, kids in the room, doorbells, dogs barking, TVs. And so the control of the environment is really specific to any given study. And neither one of these provides a perfect sense of control, but just being thoughtful in terms of what you're suggesting or where you are, and always kind of being thoughtful about what interruptions might happen and how you and your interview team want to respond to those. So kind of anticipating where some of these lack of control issues or circumstances might arise and how you want to either react to them as the team or suggest changes or differing approaches for your interviewee. When it comes to rapport and participant engagement, this can really depend a lot on your topic at hand, as well as your interviewer and their kind of personal approach. My personal preference is oftentimes for in-person for many topics. You can connect with individuals and express and read some of these nonverbal cues. There's a certain level of comfort in knowing a person, seeing them, and you can actually, you know, you have a lot of tools at your disposal in person to adjust as needed, recognize where there might be some tension or discomfort, you know, your ability to limit distractions as you're able, re-engage if you lose attention. And some of these tools are a bit more limited when it comes to telephone interviews. So, you know, you just have fewer of those tools. You're not able to read some of those nonverbal cues like you are in person. However, I would like to just say that sometimes, you know, depending on the topic at hand, the caveat to this kind of question mark for the telephone would actually be kind of the anonymity of the phone itself can help some individuals around some topics feel more comfortable discussing particularly sensitive issues. And so in certain circumstances, you could see how that might increase engagement to a degree that you might not see in person if someone was uncomfortable in that situation. A lot of this really has to do with the interviewer's ability to build rapport, establish trust within that environment where you're, in a lot of circumstances, asking a complete stranger to share intimate details of their life or their experiences or perspectives with you. So my perspective is oftentimes that you have more tools at your disposal when you do these in person. And again, my personal preference as an interviewer is often in person. However, you might have limited tools, but it's not impossible to develop this rapport and create and establish and recreate participant engagement over the course of the interview. For participant burden, we have kind of thinking about this specifically when it comes to kind of logistical burden. When it comes to telephone interviews, they tend to have a lower burden overall. You can think about issues of time, convenience, travel, schedule. They get to select their own location, ideally kind of providing themselves with a level of comfort. And again, that kind of perceived anonymity can be helpful as well. Perhaps they feel more comfortable or increased privacy for their own environment that they're able to pick. But also when it comes to scheduling, these can be a lot easier to schedule to a certain extent because you don't have to worry about travel time and finding a place. You really just need to have someone block off a time of their day so they can speak with you on the phone. What you do have to consider with telephone interviews in terms of participant burden when it comes to IRB and considerations of how consent will be completed. This will largely depend on the requirements from your IRB, whether you have verbal consent is allowed. If you need written consent, how you're going to do that. Is there an option for online consent via an email link or something like that? So thinking a little bit about how issues of consent will come into play and your participants' access to those different modes of consent as needed. So kind of you'll have to think about this and probably consider and justify these issues of consent prior to launching your study. But kind of thinking about how you want to justify that, and if participant burden is one of those for pushing for telephone issues or telephone interviews, just being thoughtful in how you're justifying that based on the study at hand. Thinking about kind of logistics, we walked through a lot of those, and those kind of overlap to a certain extent with participant burden. But I wanted to kind of pull out the technological issues, because while overall you can see kind of participant burden and logistics seem to favor the telephone interviews a bit more, technological issues are not something that we have surpassed in 2020. And so thinking about this, because it is truly the exception to kind of the belief that phone interviews might be easier to conduct. And so when you think about telephone interviews, while they might be easier to schedule and more time friendly, you can think about a lot of the different topics or technical issues that can come up. Still dealing with poor cell phone reception, what happens when you get disconnected. So from my office phone, a lot of people have blocked calls from unknown callers. And so really being thoughtful about how you're overcoming or anticipating some of these technological issues can be a bit more complex when it comes to telephone interviews in terms of it might be easier to schedule, but it can also be easier for individuals to not pick up or to ignore the call, more so than, seeing you in person and having to reschedule then. And thinking about cost overall, in a lot of ways, you're not dealing with needing to get a room, oftentimes a little bit less logistical difficulties, especially if you're trying to pay someone to come in, pay for their parking. Incentives are usually similar versus in person or telephone. But thinking about these topics overall, you can see that there's a lot of different considerations at hand. And so wanting to just be thoughtful and think about where your priorities are. So for example, if your priority is, apologies. If your priority is something, we were doing a study looking at medical marijuana users, and the priority was really to get a geographically diverse sample population. And so telephone interviews were the way to go with that. So thinking about geographically diverse populations being a priority, that would make more sense, especially when it comes to costs and logistics. It's a little bit more difficult to do the in-person throughout someplace like the United States than the telephone interviews. we can think about a study that we were doing with homeless populations, looking at cervical cancer screening, and really kind of the emphasis on going, not only doing those in person, but going into the community to do those in the community to help kind of make sure that we were being aware and active towards issues of access, inclusion, trust, rapport, meeting people on their terms and in their environment rather than bringing them into a Dana-Farber building, for example. Being really thoughtful about in clinic patient and caregiver interviews. And so what I've done and we've done for a few studies is actually it's been a mix of both in-person and telephone. This does kind of bring up some complexities when you're thinking about the type of data that you're collecting and the quality of that data. But if it's a well-designed study and it's been thoughtful in its design and the interviewers have been trained and you've kind of thought about and tried to compensate for some of these differences, we've actually had some projects where it's a mix of both, where the emphasis was really put on low participant burden. And so we would meet them in clinic, and some days, there was just a really tough day in clinic. They had a lot of appointments. It was a long day, or they had received bad news, and so it wasn't really the time. And so the option was to, reschedule for in clinic or actually give them a telephone interview option. And so it was kind of the preference of the individual who was being interviewed, just to be aware of the complexities and be very aware of the burden and be sensitive to the different issues that might be there. Just being thoughtful about, are you able to build that trust and that rapport to get feedback that you need or that you're looking for these. It's kind of how I oftentimes, when individual researchers are asking me about the pros and cons of in-person versus telephone, one of the big considerations I have them think about is who their population is. I tend to prioritize participant burden and comfort. And so, to a certain extent, if we're not able to anticipate which ones we think will be most appropriate or most acceptable to a certain population, just due to lack of research or lack of knowledge at this point, I have had people include both options in the IRB protocols to allow participants to decide which will be better. Again, you have to be thoughtful in how the data collection methods can influence or produce a particular type of bias, but overall, it's definitely something that you're able to overcome and thoughtfully kind of approach going forward. So I'm just going to pause there for one quick second. All right, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and start talking about online versus in-person focus groups. And again, I'm going to be building this on the assumption that you have a trained research team, a well-developed guide, the well-developed research questions and aims. And in many ways, what you're going to see is that the scoring of these consideration maps very similarly onto focus groups considerations. What I'm actually going to do is highlight a few key aspects and spend a little bit more time on issues around logistics and technology for the focus groups, because they do introduce some additional considerations and complications here. So thinking about data depth and quality, much like we saw before with the interviews, both of these data collection methods can produce valid and are effective ways for gathering information. And so, just being thoughtful about which one best aligns with your aims, your population at hand, and thinking about this in terms of control over the environment. One thing that I would like to emphasize here is so thinking about kind of control over the environment, to a certain extent, you have more control in a lot of ways when you have people in person. You have control over ideally distractions. You can ask people to turn off their cell phones. You have people's attention. And again, you have kind of that nonverbal cues that you can access and pull people in for the environment. You can, select the conference room, select the food that's there, select the number of people that are around the table, the recording devices. You have general control over that. One thing that I will say that is true both for online and in-person focus groups is actually participants arriving late. And so I would suggest or encourage research teams to kind of have a protocol in place for what you're going to do in terms of late arrivals, especially if there's a more involved consent process that needs to take place. You need to be able to be thoughtful about how you're going to navigate that if someone arrives late, both in person and online. Do you want to have, a certain timed cutoff where you're going to ask people to not join the group? Or do you have another individual on the research team who can take them out of the room, or text with them on the side to get them through the consent process overall? When you think about kind of control over the environment, again, in person, you are selecting the conference room or the data lab. Web-based groups are really dependent upon the web platform that's being selected. So to a certain extent, while you might be able to select your favored platform, whether that be Zoom or WebEx or GoToMeeting or Inside Heads, you need to also consider kind of device compatibility. And so I'll explore this and speak to it a little bit more when it comes to technology. But really, when you're thinking about kind of control over the environment, you've got to think about internet connectivity, glitches, downtime, internet access. Are people on different devices? Are they on a smartphone or a laptop? And how does that interface change on the platforms that you've selected? What kind of equipment is required, and how can you then kind of navigate these different limitations or complexities that have been pulled into place? You need to, be thoughtful about selecting an online platform that has compatibility with various different devices, but also thinking about how you can kind of navigate those different devices and engagement on the platform as you go through a given meeting. Really thinking, internet connectivity is a really big one, especially if you're having a discussion about a sensitive issue or a difficult issue to talk about. Having the focus group participants not be able to hear you clearly, or you not be able to hear them clearly, can be a really difficult, challenging environment to carry on a thoughtful conversation and a thoughtful group interaction. When it comes to rapport and participant engagement, this has actually shifted greatly. So in the last, I would say, even just 2 to 3 years with the online video synchronous groups, where now you have some added visual benefits that you didn't necessarily have before. The speaker pops up in yellow, multiple viewing options to see all the participants to really get kind of that more group approach. However, still, in a lot of ways, my preference for, especially around rapport and participant engagement, is you just have an extended toolbox for the in-person ones. Again, those nonverbal cues, in a lot of ways, sitting across the table from someone that you don't know. So the different participants in the group, I find that sometimes those in-person group dynamics can be a little bit more engaged than those online. But you have to then, just navigate your priorities and decision points on this. Again, like I said, there has been improvement for the visuals that come to the online video focus groups. But you're able to perhaps a little bit more recognize and see some of these nonverbal cues, even if it is over line. But overall, you can still see that there are some benefits to the in-person interview, especially perhaps depending on your population and then the need to kind of build that trust and rapport in person versus online. For participant burden, this kind of follows similarly to the telephone interview. Um, Although slightly different dynamic if you're doing a kind of video-based chat, because what you don't have are those protections of anonymity that you might have if it's just an audio focus group or if it's a text-based focus group. So in some ways, issues around anonymity become similar for the online focus group. In person, you're dealing with that as well. But the in-person burden definitely comes a little bit more when it comes to, we can go down to logistics, to think about logistics and participant burden. For kind of logistics, it's getting people in the room, coordinating multiple people's schedules, oftentimes dealing with parking or transportation for multiple individuals, coordination of time, access to buildings, meals, and thinking about getting everyone in that room at the same time, versus online, everyone needs to be able to access a link at the same time to open up their Zoom or their WebEx. But generally speaking, the lower participant burden, they don't need to travel to get to, they don't need to be in an unfamiliar environment. And they're able to kind of do this from the comfort of their own home or office, wherever they kind of feel most comfortable. You do want to be aware of Hipaa compliance, IRB considerations around privacy and confidentiality. Depending on which platform you're using, sometimes the defaults of the accounts is actually the names, full names, or even email addresses of the participants. So if you want to be on a first name basis for your focus group, you're going to want to make sure that you are prompting people to change their default username or identification code prior to signing on to the group, if they want to stay a little bit more anonymous or on a first name basis. What I do want to spend a little bit more time on is really thinking about kind of the technological considerations. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on the online video focus groups, because there are a lot of complications that come up that are really important to anticipate and think about prior to launching your group. So I would always recommend that you do a practice group regardless of the platform that you're on. And so thinking about kind of technology, if you're doing this in person, you probably need lights and a recorder. For a couple of groups, you might have, visual screen, computer screen to share something, or a handout, but kind of, pretty straightforward in person, limited kind of technology considerations, although I usually try to have 2 recorders with me for a focus group, just as kind of support and backup. For the online groups, I really always suggest that you have at least 2 individuals who are kind of helping coordinate that group, especially prior to launch. I would say you need a moderator who will kind of be the driver of the question asking and group dynamics and moving that group forward. But you also need another administrator. This could be a co-investigator, this could be an RA, a CRC, but it needs to be someone who can continually be in communication with the other participants. And so, some people won't be able to access it. They'll have trouble with their audio or their video. And so they might get kicked off and want to be able to join back in due to internet access. And so this second individual is really important for assisting with the technical issues. And so making sure that they can directly contact participants, especially if that participant is having technological issues or audio issues or video issues. But that other administrator, depending on how involved they are over the course of the group, can really be helpful to try to re-engage someone who seems to be, not fully responding to the prompts from the moderator. You really want to think about how different devices interact with different platforms. You can be on tablets, desktops, laptops, cell phones. And so thinking about how all of these different devices might impact the group. So thinking about do they impact access or, visuals or anything else that you're utilizing? And kind of thinking about technology, I'm just going to kind of throw cost in there a little bit as well, because what you'll see is that in a lot of ways, the online videos, they increase kind of technological issues, but oftentimes decrease cost. The big caveat being, what kind of platform are you using? Does your institution or your school give you free access to one of these platforms like Zoom? Does your institution have an agreement, a business associates agreement, where issues around Hipaa and IRB concerns have already been addressed? Because this can add time and complexities to your ability to perform these online groups. But if we're thinking about cost in person, you have to get a room, perhaps rent that room. You need to cover transportation, parking, meals oftentimes are being, or at least food is offered for a lot of the in-person groups. Again, compensation or incentives are very similar across in-person and online groups. And transcription costs, if you're doing kind of a video audio online group and an in-person group, will be very similar. What you do want to be sure of is how to deal with issues around microphone feedback, how that's going to interrupt your recording. And really what I find is that, in both in-person and online groups, kind of sitting forward and expectations for the group as soon as you can prior to the launch of that group. So expectations around conversations, discussion with each other, respect for other people in the group, how to perhaps anticipate and overcome some of these difficulties that might emerge, whether it's in person or online. Especially if you're thinking about online groups, I would start communicating with your on-site IRB as early as possible, just to make sure that you are aware of any complexities or special issues that might arise because you're doing those online. Thinking again about issues around consent for the online. Is verbal consent enough? Do you need written consent? How are you going to facilitate that? Can you prompt there to be a link prior to the group to do online consent? So thinking about all of that. Also, kind of for both of these, thinking about logistics, technology, and cost is being sure to once you have the group set up and people have agreed to participate, making sure that you have a specific study number, making sure that you're being thoughtful with the reminder calls or reminder emails. So kind of thinking about these overall. So with the online as well as the in-person focus groups, really kind of being most thoughtful about which one isn't just the most convenient for you or fits best with your costs for your study, but thinking kind of more broadly about all of these different considerations. Which one best aligns with the priorities that you have for your individual study? So for one of the online groups, it was a study looking at experiences of individuals living with narcolepsy. And again, the priority was really to garner a geographically diverse group. And so both with patients as well as caregivers, the priority for the geographic diversity was online video groups. And so thinking about kind of who your population is. So knowing your population, knowing your priorities. To a certain extent, we have kind of this digital divide in terms of access and awareness and familiarity with our generations. So think about kind of how much work or how much computer literacy or internet literacy do you need to extend to your participants prior to the launch of the group. Kind of thinking about participant convenience of the in-person versus web-based, participant comfort, what the topic you are, how sensitive it is, and where that sensitivity will be best covered or explored. Thinking about the age of your cohorts. So a lot of the online focus groups that I have been doing recently have been with AYA populations who have a general level of computer and internet literacy. but we have done some with older caregivers that have worked really well. But again, kind of being thoughtful and scientifically justifying which one matches best with your kind of priorities. You know, for a certain extent, we prioritized in-person focus groups and went out to the community to actually hold in-person focus groups, not at Dana-Farber, but actually within local community-based organizations and local faith-based organizations, to really, you know, help better establish that rapport, that trust, and demonstrate our desire to kind of better understand some of these situations and topics within the context of that community. And then, you know, you can also just think about, you know, convenience to a certain extent, but now we're also facing, you know, limitations. So some of you might be pushed more towards online video focus groups because of what's happening with the COVID-19 social distancing and requirements and limitations there. But I would just kind of step back and be thoughtful about, you know, what are the pros and cons of delaying or postponing your in-person groups versus really switching online. What are you going to gain? What are you going to lose? And do those match up with your priorities overall? So I think I'll end there for now. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon to explore in-person versus remote data collection. Don't hesitate to reach out with any questions you might have, and my contacts on the Survey and Data Management Core website. Again, my name is Anna, and I hope you are all well and safe. Take care.